The lifeboats are a much-loved and very important institution that has saved some 140,000 lives since its inception almost 200 years ago. But did you know that the history of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution started right here on the Isle of Man? 200 years ago, almost to the day, on the 14th of December 1822, British naval ship HMS Racehorse was on the way to Douglas when the pilot in charge of the ship mistook a light on the shore somewhere along here with the pier light of Douglas Harbour. As a result, he took a fateful turn that would lead to the vessel violently hitting the rocks near Langnass, an event that has recently been commemorated with this newly unveiled plaque here in Castletown. The captain of the ship sent for help, and some of the crew members of HMS Racehorse managed to reach Castletown later that evening. Locals immediately ran out, grabbed a boat and made multiple trips to the stricken vessel, managing to rescue most of the crew in the process. Now remember, these were just locals who were probably just resting in the evening. They had no professional equipment, no professional lifeboats, nothing. They just went out, risked their own lives, and they managed to indeed rescue most of the crew. Tragically, on the very last trip back from the stricken vessel, a wave overturned their boat. 6 crew members and 3 local volunteers died as a result. The local men, Norris Britson, Thomas Hall and Robert Quayle, were buried in the Maloo churchyard not far from here, and the graves are still there today. What the people involved with this rescue wouldn't have known back then is that these deaths and this incident as a whole led to the creation of the RNLI. The crew members of HMS Racehorse who lost their lives that night were members of the British Navy, and as a result the British government took care of their families and basically made sure they suffered no undue financial hardship. The families of the 3 volunteers who had lost their lives weren't so lucky. Because they weren't members of the Navy or of any acknowledged organization, they basically got nothing, and 3 families lost their breadwinners that night. Isle of Man resident Sir William Hillary thought that this was profoundly unfair, and having been involved himself in the rescue of crew members from HMS Vigilant who had crashed onto the rocks near the Isle of Man just 2 months earlier, he knew exactly how dangerous it was and what was involved in trying to rescue people at sea. As a result of this incident and his previous experiences, he wrote to the Admiralty in London suggesting that an organization should be created, staffed by professionals and with proper crews and equipment and procedures for the rescue of lives at sea. In February 1823, he wrote a pamphlet, the name of which I have to read off this note because it is simply too long. It was called An Appeal to the British Navy on the Humanity and Policy of Forming a National Institution for the Preservation of Lives and Property from Shipwreck. I'm glad they changed that name to RNLI these days. Anyway, the response of the Admiralty unfortunately was lukewarm, and they weren't really interested in his idea. Instead of getting the Navy to pay it, Sir William Hillary had to turn to philanthropists to find the money to turn his idea into reality. Luckily, some people were on board with his idea, and the National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck was founded on the 4th of March of 1824. They even managed to get the King as patron for the organization, and its headquarters was based in London. The next step was to build the first lifeboat and the first lifeboat station. And this one you can still see today in Douglas Harbour, because this one behind me here, that is RNLI station number 1. The very first lifeboat station built by Sir William Hillary for his new organization. This one is actually due for a bit of an upgrade, or in fact a new build, in 2024 when the organization celebrates its 200th anniversary. And I think it's well deserved, but while it still serves its purpose, you can see it's not really the latest design anymore. Since Sir William Hillary started the RNLI, it has grown into a UK and Ireland-wide organization with 238 stations and 349 lifeboats at the moment. Still entirely staffed by volunteers and mostly paid for by donations. I think only about 2% of their expenses are paid for by the government. This fantastic organization continues to save lives at sea every single day of the year. Now you might now think that Sir William Hillary would have just retired after having all this work and just watched this organization grow from a distance, but he wasn't that kind of guy. A few years later, 60-year-old Sir William took part in the rescue of the St. George, a vessel that had struck Conister Rock, which is the rock in Douglas Bay, and he went out with the lifeboat, with the crews, and everyone survived, everyone was rescued. But this particular incident led him to build what we now know as the Tower of Refuge, which is one of the best known landmarks of the Isle of Man, and it's that little tower that sits on Coniston Rock in Douglas Bay. The purpose of this rock was, before all this was built, before the breakwater and everything, if a vessel approached Douglas, got it wrong and hit the rock, then the crew could take refuge in that tower. There would have been water and food and basically shelter. And then you could wait out the night or wait out the storm, and when things get a bit calmer, someone would go over there and get you. The rock, of course, isn't really needed for that purpose anymore these days, but it's still a landmark, and it's still, I think, 190 years old this year or next year. So, you know, it's there to stay, and it's basically one of our most famous landmarks. You can still walk over to it if the tide is low, if the tide is very, very low. And these days it's not sailors finding shelter there, but there is an organized walk where the RNLI helps once a year. And pretty much on a regular basis, people also walk over, and 2 or 3 always get stuck there every year and then have to be rescued by the very lifeboat that the person who built the tower also founded. Hillary was also instrumental in the recommendation to build a new Douglas breakwater, and many years later, this is the version we have now, but it was actually kind of his thinking and his pushing for it that led to the creation of what we see here today. Sir William Hillary died on the 5th of January 1847, aged 76 years old, and he's actually buried in Douglas, in the centre of Douglas, in St. George's Churchyard. His grave is still there. You can go and visit it. It's just off Athol Street. And there are also 2 other memorials to him. There is one on Douglas Head, the statue of him looking out over Douglas Bay and of course over the lifeboat station and the tower he created. And there's also a memorial on Douglas Promenade to the rescue of the St. George, and it's right next to the Beatty statue. You go down in the sunken gardens, it's right there. There's no doubt that Sir William Hillary was an important person for the Isle of Man and Britain as a whole, and his legacy luckily lives on with the RNLI and the tower. The RNLI is probably more needed today than ever. People still get into distress at sea. It is a dangerous sea out there. These days they have modern equipment. Just imagine going out there in the olden days in a wooden boat without all the kit we have. It must have been terrifying. So the bravery of these guys is unbelievable. If you haven't donated to the RNLI, remember they are primarily funded by donations. Please consider doing so. They are great guys. They are available 24/7, 365. And having been a sailor myself, I used to work for the steam packet. I can tell you that knowing someone is out there to help you if you are in distress, that's a great feeling to have. And their work is really, really valuable. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, that's basically the story how the RNLI started in the Isle of Man.